Hello, hello, apa khabar? And welcome to Virtually Peranakan Fest 2022, celebrating our colourful culture. Now, this is our third edition of this online Peranakan festival organized by Peranakan Sayang, and we are very happy to see all of our Sayangs from around the world. Kamsia very much for joining us today. Please say hello and where you are watching this stream from in the comments section. We would love to hear from you. My name is Alvin Un, and it's my pleasure to host you for this session. Now, the first session for our festival is a very interesting one. It's about the Baba-Nonya culture of the Straits Settlement. It is indeed a very fascinating, eclectic and hybrid sub-Chinese culture with strong influences from the Malay and European cultures, whose golden period is said to be around the 1870s to the 1920s. Now, while the Babas were prominent in the public sphere and the culture follows a patrilineal system, the colourful Nyonyas are no less illustrious. Let's uncover to find out if the Peranakan Straits Chinese culture is a patriarchy or a matriarchy. And it's my pleasure to have with us today Dr. David Neo from Kuala Lumpur, who is an active member of the Persatuan Peranakan Baba-Nonya Kuala Lumpur and Selangor. So let's welcome Baba David. Hello, Baba David. Apa khabar?
Okay, bye. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, Alvin.
Yes, it's a real pleasure to have you and on such an interesting topic as well. So let's quickly dive in because I know you have a lot to share with all our viewers this afternoon. So let's get into the presentation.
Okay, thank you. It's like, so I would sort of like run through some of the stuff that I have been researching, and I guess everyone can decide for themselves whether you think the Baba-Nonya culture is a patriarchy or a matriarchy. Yeah, so um, okay, so let me just sort of like start off. This was basically a quote from someone I interviewed, yeah, and I really think it's kind of interesting and very telling as well in terms of sort of like what was said at the interview, right? So the question was the idea of the Garang Lihai Nonya. Is this something that you can relate to? Well, we are sort of like asking questions specifically surrounding the TV series The Little Nyonya. Um, so if you could relate it to the series and real life, and the response was, I'd say there's truth in it. I see it in myself, I guess. And I asked if it is cultural, and she responded, I think my mom was the domineering one over my dad in general with matters in the household. I grew up in that kind of household. To think why my dad would have chosen a woman who takes the lead in those areas, it could be something he was used to in his household. Yeah, so I think in most Peranakan homes, I think we can relate to this. Um, okay, so I will just sort of like give a little bit of theoretical framework to kind of like frame this, and particularly with Sylvia Walby's work on patriarchy. Yeah? So she has basically sort of like looked or conceptualize patriarchy in these six spheres: paid employment, household production, culture, sexuality, violence, and state. So we will particularly be looking at the household production, I guess, like, in terms of your Peranakan homes. And yeah, I think hopefully we'll have some time at the end, and I like to hear what other people have to say about their own experiences about growing up in Peranakan households. Yeah, so the Babas were clearly occupying a very masculine, gendered public sphere and public patriarchy. Yeah, they were often considered as compradors that assisted the British, particularly in the Straits. Yeah, so particular to our context, they were capitans, they were tingchus, justices of peace, holding public offices. Um, for those of you who come from Singapore and the other parts of the Straits Settlements, roads, hospitals, bridges, towers, etc., were named after a lot of Peranakans, or rather Babas, in the Straits Settlements. Social clubs and associations were also very much part of their lifestyle, where they were basically mimicking the British in terms of sports and hunting. And for those of you who are in Singapore, the Peranakan Museum produced a book that was called The Great Peranakans, 50 Remarkable Lives. Essentially shows you sort of like, the dominance of the masculine space by Baba men. And I think there was really just one female that was focused in that. So the public space, with the Peranakans were very much a very masculine space. So one example, Tan Kim Ching, who was the eldest son of Tan Tock Seng, I think is one good example where he actually pacified the Larut War, the Larut Wars in Perak, and he was also trading premium rice from Bangkok. Basically, so he was actually very prominent. He was also the man that was actually responsible for introducing Anna Leonowens to the Chinese court. So your king and I, he had actually very strong connections with the Thai court, and I believe he even actually did host Mongkut and Chulalongkorn in his house in Singapore. So you can sort of like see the public space that your babas basically occupied. Okay, so going to sort of like your Chinese patriarchal or patrilineal system, this is your private form or within your Peranakan household. Chinese ancestral worship obviously was very central to Peranakan culture, and the whole idea of your Rumah Abu is also very strong and central to Peranakan culture, where the responsibility and the maintenance goes basically to the eldest son. And that also usually means that he will get a larger share, if not the largest share, of the inheritance. And you will see that, I guess, this whole sort of upholding patrilineal is very important with Peranakan culture, where actually siring sons are very important in the culture to carry on the family name. So your turunan is like, was very important to actually have someone to carry your name, and a lot of times if they don't, they will actually resort to adopting or what's known as anak kuipang. So the importance of siring sons actually gives license to having gunde or concubines in your prominent Peranakan households. It's like, so if the primary wife is not able to sire sons, it gives license to actually have concubines so that a son can be produced in the family. Your tonghuan, or the sort of like carrying on of responsibility, particularly with the death rites, in Peranakan funerals, is performed by the eldest son. And if the eldest son dies, it's not the second son that actually takes over this. It actually goes to the next generation, where the eldest grandson will assume this responsibility. So this whole sort of like patrilineal system is very important and central to Peranakan culture. And your genealogical records actually follow strictly very Chinese patrilineal system, where it's actually difficult to trace the Nonyas if you're trying to sort of like, find out more about Nonyas or lineages from Nonyas. And this kind of also lends to the whole patrilineal inheritance, where the estate usually goes to male. yeah, and jewelry will usually go to females. So you have very commonly your Peranakan patriarchs who will ikat harta, and they will actually pass their wealth to actually their grandchildren or the grandsons rather than their sons, basically to try to keep their wealth as intact as long as possible. Yeah, I think my maternal great grandfather actually ikat harta sampai cicit. Yeah, so he actually went one generation after that. So this is very much sort of like the culture of the Peranakans, and if you sort of like are familiar with the recent bestseller, The Ghost Bride, which became a Netflix series as well, is actually premised on sort of like these ideas with the Peranakan culture. Okay. Okay. Oops. A bit too fast here. I have a quote here from Kujui, which I think is really quite appropriate to summarize sort of like Nonyas and their role in the Peranakan world. Yeah, so she actually writes, while the public domain was dominated by the Babas, the home was more often than not run and ruled by strong-willed Nonyas who had been trained to cope with with a variety of household and social tasks. She was managing director par excellence, and the supreme boss of the palatial Baba-Nonya residence. Upon marriage, the demure young Nyonya, still a child, found herself thrust into a responsible position with increased difficulty as she embraced motherhood. Added to the family duties were social obligations befitting her status in society. By the time she became a mother-in-law and grandmother, she would have acquired some confidence in social matters. When she rose to the position of matriarch in charge of running an extended family under one roof, the Nyonya would have emerged as an assertive, sometimes even bossy woman. The mature Nyonya ladies who gaze confidently from the portraits have a commanding air and also convey an impression of sound common sense. The matriarchs assumed a precedence over their sons upon the death of their husbands. While wielding authority, Nyonya mothers doted on their sons, and the result was many a mature Baba, even though he had status and was respected in the outside world, often continued to submit to an uncompromising mother at home. Yeah, it's like I think we can, or many of us can relate to that. Um, Okay, so I found this picture online or this photograph online, and I really kind of thought it was quite interesting because trying to sort of like figure out the background of or the context of this photograph, I think will leave many questions, right? Because I was sort of thinking, okay, how are these women related? How are these nonyas related? Are they wives of a Baba? It's like they do not look uh, or they don't do not resemble each other at all. So are they? I don't think they're related. It's like and I think they're probably the wives and concubine of a prominent Baba. And so who would be the primary wife? Who would be sort of like the gunde, who would be the favorite concubine? Yeah, it's like these are the sort of like intrigues of your grand prominent Peranakan families. Yeah, it's like and all the cerita rumah tangga that we sort of like grew up with. Yeah, so I guess it kind of shows the dynamics that goes on within a Peranakan household. Yeah. Okay, let me just move on to the next slide here. So just to give a historical and cultural context to the Nonyas. Yeah. So Peter Lee basically says that they were slave women of heterogeneous origins. Yeah, basically from Bali, Sulawesi, Papua, Thailand, Burma, and even coastal India. Um, what's interesting actually about this sort of like background to your Nonyas is that there's actually Peter Lee actually sort of like talks about this in his book Sarong Kebaya about Kapitan Gan Lee, yeah, who died in 1648. Now his widow, Madam Bali, which is the Hokkien transliteration of Bali, succeeded him. Yeah, and she was actually the first and the only female Kapitan in Batavia's history. Yeah, Batavia is your name for Jakarta. So she was the one and only, but she actually was it I think 16 years that she was actually the Kapitan. So a female Kapitan, and this is I guess the interesting thing about your Peranakan culture, where I think it's not it's women have actually a lot more power than we actually realize. Yeah, where she is actually able to sort of like hold the position of a Kapitan in Batavia's history. So what sort of I think makes this possible too is the context that the Pranakans kind of like thrived and flourished, which was basically that they were Chinese merchants, yeah, and at one time they were basically very much dictated by the monsoons, where they could be away as long as 6 months, yeah, before the winds come again, where they can actually sail back home or back to China. So they could spend, as long as like 6 months in certain places, and therefore the women actually had to be very independent, or rather the Nyonya wives, right? They were left here a lot of times with their children, and also to maintain and to continue the family business. So your Nonyas actually, I think, were very capable and independent women from their cultural context, yeah, and this is sort of your Peranakan context, but to sort of like the larger archipelago, Malay archipelago kind of like context and culture, you also have this idea of merantau with the Minangkabau culture, yeah, where men are also, kind of like encouraged, or it's a cultural ideal where they would actually travel to gain wealth, yeah, and the women actually will stay back to mind the family and whatever else. So in the larger context of sort of like South Southeast Asia, I think women actually do probably enjoy a lot more sort of like independence and equality than in other parts of the world. Yeah. So, Owen, can I go back to the slides? Thank you. I need to sort of like refer to that. So that is sort of like your Chinese merchants context. Often your Nyonya widows and daughters also inherited exorbitant wealth. Yeah, it's like from the business and whatnot. And this also basically, I think, gave women or the Nonyas a lot more power than in most cultures. And the last point that I have is this whole idea of your Chincho, which is basically a Hokkien matrilocal marriages. Yeah, it's like, so in Hokkien cultures, it's like, if oftentimes when the family is rich enough, they would actually take on the sons-in-law. Yeah, it's like, where they will marry, and the sons-in-law will actually get absorbed into the wife's family, rather than the wife moving out and going to the husband's family. So this is also another factor, I think, that sort of like creates this context for for your Nonyas and for the fact that the Nonyas are quite strong and domineering. Yeah. Um, so that's the historical kind of like background uh, to the Peranakan culture and sort of like the golden age of the Peranakans. Now going specifically to the Nonyas, it's like I think that the Nonyas were very privileged and valued. Yeah. Um, so Chinese Chinese culture was patrilineal and actually patrilocal as well. But Peranakan culture was patrilineal but matrilocal. Yeah, so we also have this term in Patwa that says cuci kaki naik ranjang, that refers to your matrilocal or matrifocal sort of like marriages, used kind of like derogatorily. But yes, it's like that is also a reality. So although boys were valued, Peranakans actually did not practice female infanticide, right? It's like, that was a reality in China because they valued their boys. Yeah, but you never see that actually happening with Peranakan culture. And this whole idea of duit tete is like, which is money that's kind of like given to the bride's mother at the wedding is actually just a token acceptance, right? Most of the time it's like the with the ang pao, the bride's family would just take a token amount and then return the rest to the groom, because Peranakans do not sell their daughters. Yeah, they value their daughters. It's like you kind of like have a lot of families who will strongly say that kita tak jual anak. Yeah. So the Nonyas were very valued in that sense. Yeah. The Nonyas also never had their feet bound. That was basically a very Chinese tradition. Yeah, so which is another thing I think that sort of like is very telling of the status of the Nonyas. There was never a shortage of Nonyas. Yeah, it's like so because of that, they were actually very stringently controlled by your Peranakan families. Because essentially your Nonyas, the family will ensure that the Nonyas will kahwin samkai, right? So essentially they will basically become primary wives and not secondary wives or gundits of prominent families. Yeah, it's like and that only changed with World War II. Yeah, where times have sort of like changed, or the very rare exception of ganti tiket, where the primary wife might have actually died young, it's like and she's got children, and so the sister might become the second wife, and the whole idea of that is that having someone related to the wife being the secondary wife, they kind of think that that person will not ill-treat like her nieces and nephews and will just continue assuming the role of a Nyonya in the home. Yeah, so those were sort of like your cultural context in which the Nonyas were brought up and kind of like the culture that they lived. Yeah, so there was actually no shortages of men, because you could either find babas, or if not babas, your Peranakan families will quite happily marry them to very promising singkets. Yeah, where they will like essentially just absorb them into matrilocal situations, contexts, because most of them are usually quite wealthy, and there is no need to there's no need for the wife to sort of like move out of the family. In fact, they actually do not want the daughters to move out of the family because they did not want them to be bullied. Yeah, it's like so they actually kind of like tried to keep them within the family, and of course that was an advantage for your singkets, because it was like it was you get married into a prominent family, and then you get all the advantages and the benefits from that. The next point is the Nonyas were also very educated. Yeah, it's like so with your with boys sort of like getting education, you also have Nonyas starting to get education, and I think they probably were the first sort of like women who who were educated, yeah, in Southeast Asia. Um, you have people like Queenie Chang, right, who wrote the Nyonya Memories of a Nyonya, I believe it's like, and then I will also be talking about Mrs. Lee Chung Wan, yeah, who was quite prominent in Singapore society. Then let me just move on to also Lee Choo Neo, who was basically your first female queen scholar and first female physician in the Straits Settlements. Okay, I do have a picture or pictures of her later. So you can sort of like see the context in which, Nonyas were basically brought up. So the Nonyas were, like I said, likely, the first educated women in the Straits Settlements in Southeast Asia. And if their husbands are Sinkates or non-Peranakans, it could be that the Nonyas would have been better educated than their husbands. Yeah. The Babas also set up schools, like in Singapore, very prominently, your Singapore Chinese Girls' School was set up by Dr. Lim Boon Keng and Sir Song Ong Siang. Yeah. Okay, so this is Lee Choo Neo. Yeah, she was your first queen scholar and first female physician in the Straits Settlements. So yeah, you can sort of like see the context in which women kind of like grew up. So she was born in 1895 and died in 1947. Yeah. Now this is Mrs. Lee Chung Wan, or better known as the Diamond Queen. Yeah, it's like and she was known as the Diamond Queen basically because her diamond collection rivaled that of the Sultana of Johor. Yeah. So you can see her diamond necklace, and yeah, it has quite amazing diamond collection. Yeah. So she was basically described as your grand old lady of Singapore. And she was the first in many. Yeah? She was the first woman to achieve many firsts. She was the first Straits Chinese woman to be educated in English. Also, the first Chinese woman to drive a car in Singapore, and it was no ordinary car, but a sleek Daimler. Right? She was also the first Chinese lady to be awarded the member of the British Empire in 1918. Okay. Now she was this socialite. Yeah, it's like and her maiden name was Tan Teck Neo, and she became Mrs. Lee Chung Wan, and also known as Diamond Queen. So she was born in 1877 and died in 1978. Like I said before, her diamond collection rivaled that of your Sultana of Johor. She was the leading light of Singapore society for more than 5 decades. She was the third daughter of Tan Yong Siak, a wealthy Malaccan businessman who moved to Singapore. And he actually engaged Miss Blackmore, a Methodist missionary, to educate his 3 daughters. Yeah. Her parties were legendary, and she glided in and out of your private and public patriarchy, yeah? Where she was known to have outdrunk and outdanced many younger than she. Yeah, so you can sort of like see how your Nonyas were actually able to, she was one that was actually able to penetrate your public sphere, yeah, where she was sort of like respected, in society as a Nyonya. So you can sort of like see the status and the context in which the Nyonya sort of like, thrive in your Peranakan world. Okay, so interestingly, to sort of like go into female oppression in the Peranakan culture, I actually think that the female oppression came from Nonyas, um, rather than from the Babas. Yeah. So let's sort of like talk a little bit about this. Yeah. So match-made weddings were basically very common with at that time. Yeah, because it was marriage were political. They were basically to sort of like marry two prominent families where they can also expand their empire and their wealth. Yeah. So they were basically political and also probably orchestrated by Nonyas. Yeah. And usually you meet your husbands only on the wedding day. Yeah. Uh, Nonyas at that time were pretty much cloistered. Yeah, if you sort of like know your Peranakan homes, you have sections of the homes that have screens. Yeah, and these screens are basically for the Nonyas to look out and for no one to be able to look into to sort of like see the Nonyas in the household. Like if you sort of like look at Elvin's background you can sort of like see those screens and those screens sort of like tell you how a Peranakan home is set up. Yeah, so very much they were very cloistered and you don't actually leave the house until you sort of or can get out of the house until you're married. Yeah. uh, and this whole idea of the tyranny of the mother-in-law is very much a reality in Peranakan culture. Yeah. So you have Lee here, who actually has this quote. It's like, and this is Lee Chunyo, who I was talking about, yeah, where she was writing, and she said that the tyranny and unjust treatment of daughter-in-law of the daughter-in-law is a special privilege to the mother-in-law who exercises it without compunction or mercy. Yeah. And I have two other sort of like sayings in Peranakan here, which I think kind of is very telling about how the culture conceives and constructs sort of like your mother-in-law. Yeah. So the whole idea is that you cannot you maki anak to sende your menantu. Yeah. So you do not scold. You cannot you scold your own daughter to basically insult your daughter-in-law. Yeah, because it's like the idea is that you didn't raise your daughter-in-law, so you do not have the right to scold her. But this is sort of like your underhanded kind of like communication to your daughter-in-law. So you can sort of like see how mothers-in-law are basically very revered in the Peranakan culture. Uh, Another saying, sedap, lauk sedap sampai neo lalu pun tak sedar. Yeah, it's like, so if the food is so good that, actually when your mother-in-law passes, you don't even realize that. It's another sort of like cultural construct about your fierce mother-in-law. Yeah. So this is sort of like the context we're talking about, where I think it's really the women who are oppressing women rather than the babas who are actually oppressing the nonyas. Yeah. Now with your kunde and your concubinage as well, what is interesting is that particularly if you are not a nonya, that is the only your only way of sort of like upward mobility is actually to become a kunde of or a concubine of a prominent Baba. Yeah, so this was pretty much sort of like the world, and that the world that your Peranakan sort of like lived in, and that was basically where you would sort of like see this bullying, right? So if your children of concubines may sort of like set themselves, high children of primary wives may set themselves sort of like above children of concubines because they were more legitimate, or yeah, or if you have sons, it's like you will have more power, and these were the kind of like power dynamics that went on in your Peranakan household. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sort of like watching the time. Better sort of like hurry along here so that we perhaps can have some time with questions later. Okay, so this is also a quote from one of my interviewees. Yeah, it's like where she says, "History repeats itself. Women, we are our worst enemies. I believe women are bullying each other. The babas left home to the women to run. As far as as my family is concerned, the babas were the breadwinners. They don't care what you do. If you want to play checky, you play lah. These marriages were match made, so women's role is to reproduce, to have and look after children, to bring up sons. If you talk about love as what we have now, where there is care and mutual respect, I don't believe that was something that was featured in their lives. That women is there to be the mother, to make sure the surname goes down. At the end of the day, the men left all the women at home. It's the woman's uh, sorry, at the end of the day, the men left all to the women at home. It's the women who are their worst enemies. The mothers-in-law will do exactly the same thing to their daughters-in-law. They suffered because their mother-in-law gave them hell. They were doing the same. So I believe it has to stop with me. But I had a good, beautiful mother-in-law in life. Mother-in-law in life. Many times, it's the same women who are their worst enemies. You can see the women who are creating hell. Two sisters in the series, the little Nyonya, who are cheating. Always the same women. The men don't care less. Yeah. So again, I think this is also very telling. With someone that I interviewed for this project. Yeah. So I guess given that context, it's like I sort of like am posing the question, and I think it's up to you to decide whether you think this is a matriarchy or a patriarchy. Yeah, it's like it's I think in form, it is very patriarchal, but then who actually rules the roost in your Peranakan homes, I think is something that well, maybe we can hear some responses from the people out there about what they think about this.
Very good, David. So it's an open-ended question, whether it's matriarchy or patriarchy. I guess it's subjective to each family and the characters in each family that determines whether it's a matriarchy or a patriarchy. But we'd just like to say hello to everybody because we've got viewers from around the world, of course, from Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, US, even Canada and Japan as well. So hello everybody, thank you for saying hi. Even your cousin Evelyn Tan is watching in. So hello to Evelyn and everybody. Well, we do have some comments and some contributions, especially from Father Chris, who's in Australia. He was sharing about the role of the men in society, and he mentioned about fountains and waterworks were also dedicated to Babas like Koh Siang
Exactly.
Tak and Balik Pulau Penang. And even in Singapore, we have similar Tan Kim Seng, the Tan Kim Seng fountain that's at the Esplanade Padang area. It's also found over there. And interestingly, he has also contributed to the fact that they call it Chiap Ao Siu in Penang, where the younger sister marries the husband of the elder sister who has passed away. So very much similar in all.
Well, yeah, it's like that's your ganti tiket, right? It's like
Yeah. So if you do have any experiences or thoughts on this topic, do share. And there was somebody who asked whether this is available on YouTube. Yes, it is available on YouTube as well as on our Facebook page. So if we'll see whether there's any comments from you guys, any questions that you'd like to put to David, you're more than welcome. So David, in your family, is it matriarchal or patriarchal?
I think it's matriarchal. Cukup garang the Nonyas.
Yes, I think for my side as well, it's the same. And also for another reason that the ladies tend to live longer than the men. So the older ladies tend to be around, so they tend to be the head of the family. So I guess that contributes to the matriarchal. What do you think?
Exactly. It's like, a lot of babas, I don't know if it's from the diet, like I think a lot of them actually drop dead like at 50.
Not because of the wife,
They
no?
who knows maybe. But yeah, it's like, the so you get your matriarchs who actually sort of like yeah, survive, and then they run the family, and that's the thing. The I think it's also very interesting in terms of sort of like, Malay culture and women, yeah, because this whole idea of ibu as well, I think, is very much well, your whole idea of mother and ibu is very much respected, and uh, pretty much the culture here. So, your mothers and matriarchs actually hold a lot of power. It's like, so I think that also gets, infiltrated into your Peranakan culture, where yeah, it's like, so like the quote was saying, it's like, even though the Baba may actually be very successful, in the household, it's like, his mother will basically have the final say in everything. And yeah, so it's, I mean, if you look at Emily of Emerald Hill, right? It's like, she becomes the matriarch. It's like, and she rules everything as well. So you sort of like see these realities in the arts, and how Peranakan culture is also being represented, yeah, in the media.
Yeah. Just a couple of comments before we wrap up this session, because we do have another session going on very shortly. Yen Kwang has stated that the Apek do business, earn money, and the Bibi spend the money. Nyonya Bibi annually celebrates their birthday, but Apek hardly celebrates their own birthday. I think it's quite general of men to, not make such a big deal over their special days, but the women, of course, we celebrate their birthdays, especially for the children to celebrate their mom's birthday. So I think that's quite common throughout the generations. And another question on Lee Kuan Yew by Kenneth. Do we consider Harry Lee Kuan Yew, I suppose it's a wrong spelling, considered a Baba? Yes, he is definitely a Baba. He's a Hakka Baba. So yes, so that is some sharing from our guests, and thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, and we really have to move on to the next event that is going on, our next program. But before we do that, I'd like to thank Dr. David Nyo for really presenting this session with all of us today. So thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate. Thank you so much, Baba.
Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, thank you very much. We certainly hope you enjoyed that session. We certainly hope you will join us for our next session. It's Peranakan Lasting Legacy with Norman Cho at 2 p.m. It's time for us to cuci mata lah with all our Peranakan material culture. So don't miss that. That's happening in a very short while. This has been Virtually Peranakan Fest 2022, celebrating our colourful culture, organized by Peranakan Sayang. My name is Alvin Un. We'll see you soon. Take care.